All right, so welcome to the 1000 Amp podcast. My name is Matt Schell. I'm your host, and on this show, we talk about indie game development, programming, Unity, and all the things in between those topics. And today, I'm joined by Jason Storey, who is a software developer based in Ireland. Hi, Jason. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I think I've been really enjoying the content that you've been putting out in a couple of different places, probably mainly with Charles Amat on the Infallible Code channel. Some really great conversations there around topics like software architecture and kind of software design. And that's a topic that I'm kind of personally interested in. And then, so, to kind of cue the audience in on some backstory, one of the things that we started to talk about off camera over email was the idea of making some videos together about software design patterns, specifically as they relate to Unity. And I thought that you had a very interesting response there, which was to point me to a blog post that you had written about why you do not like kind of centering software design patterns, specifically in the context of teaching, right, which is what we're trying to do here. And there was a pretty interesting story that was kind of tied up in that I think also gives people a little chance to get to know you and your biography. So maybe we'll start there, and then we can kind of see where things take us.
Cool. Yeah, so it's funny. It's one of those topics that gets a lot of requests on just the video stuff we do. There's a lot of requests for specifically, can you do a video on the command pattern, on, factory patterns and so on and so forth. And it's funny because I used to be a huge advocate for patterns. Like I was the pattern guy. When I was in school and college, I was the one who was, talking about it all the time. I have the books behind me somewhere. I have like 5 books on design patterns in there. And I used to be the guy who would say how great they are because to me, so when I was in college and I was studying programming, I was lucky. So I went in and I'd never done programming before. I hadn't done computing outside of, I was always the computer guy, but I was the computer guy in the sense of if someone has a broken VCR, they assume I'll know how to fix it kind of thing, Yeah. But I'd never done programming. And to me, that could, for all I knew, that could have been a nightmare, right? Because I had no idea if it's the same mindset to, run debuggers and fix viruses on a computer than it is the program. For all I know, it could be, oil and water, and I could go in, I could be floundering and whatever.
Yeah.
But luckily enough, I didn't. Thankfully, of all of the topics, I was absolutely just killed it with programming. It was the one thing that just clicked with me. And
Amazing.
So, yeah, there's we had other modules too. We had Spanish and business and other stuff. And I was getting a solid 40, just barely passing on every topic. Yeah. But I was getting 95s and 98s in programming. And I was just like, oh, thankfully, this is the thing that I get.
Amazing,
so Yeah, and for my course, programming was worth double credits. So I was extra lucky because the programming courses, because it was the title of the course, was worth twice as many credits for my course, everything else. So I could skirt by failing-ish everything else and then decided to put a programming. So the reason I say that is simply to say that it seems weird for me to say that I don't like programming design patterns because I do, I still like them. But the problem I had was I was top of my class for a while, and I was so far ahead that I was kind of getting bored of the, they were teaching loops and basic object-oriented stuff, and I'm like, anybody who, once you're passionate about something, you'll find resources online, you'll pick it up pretty fast, right? So I was watching YouTube videos, I was downloading tons of content, I was doing all this stuff, and I wanted to get to the next level. I wanted to kind of figure out what the next step was. And to me, design patterns just seem to be like this magic trick, right? Everyone's learning fundamentals of loops and that kind of thing, but there's books of patterns, of these arcane correct answers. All you have to do is plug them in and your code is better. It sounds like such a great idea.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I had that feeling as well when I started to say, aha, there's a system, there's a way, and this is learnable, right? And I think it's a good thing to tease out of this that programming is a forest of complexity, right? You have interoperating systems, you have things that can affect one another and need to kind of connect with one another and eventually architect together. And so it's a complex environment, right? And so that desire to impose order, right? And that desire to believe that order and beautiful kind of structure is possible, I think is very it's very human and very compelling, right? So I definitely understand the appeal. I experienced that of like, yeah, oh, okay, now something that's going to kind of impose structure on this. So yeah, I kind of had that reaction too.
Yeah, I always had the joke that it feels like programmers feel like gods, because there's that point I think every programmer has where you write, your first if statement, if this, do this, and then you usually, for my case, it was Java, and it was sort of getting input from the command line. I'm like, wait a minute, I can take any input, run any series of commands on it, I can do anything I want. And suddenly you're building like really silly applications that print out stuff, but it's just like, I did this. I made the computer do what I want through sheer force of will. Until you hit those brick walls of like, class A talks to class B, how do I do it? Oh no, I'm suddenly confused. What's the relationship between the two? And you sort of panic, and that's where the book of answers comes in, But yeah, so to answer your question, the reason I don't like to sort of propose design patterns anymore is because at first it looks like templates, right? Like the implication is that it's a template solution to a problem. And you kind of think like you're doing the right thing. You're saying, if I learn the templates, I can apply them to my problems, and then I solve my problems. But I did this for years, and the problem I had was I started hating the code I wrote because the code got really, really complicated, and I was kind of begrudging the anytime I'd have to add new features to it, I was just kind of hoping I wouldn't have to. And that seems really weird, because you read what design patterns are for, and they're supposed to make that easy. That's literally their job, to make the extension and adding bits easy.
Yeah.
And so I knew there's a disconnect, right? There's something wrong here if I'm applying design patterns and my code is getting conceptually worse if I don't like using it.
Yeah. No, I think that's very... And I think what we're starting to kind of point towards there is that, and this is something that you kind of alluded to maybe in the next part of your article, is like, we're kind of starting to talk about the difference between knowledge and wisdom, right? I can tell you, this is a rake, and this is a shovel, and this is a hoe, and one of them can scrape the ground, and the other one can dig a hole, and go forth, right? That does not mean you're going to be able to grow any plants, right? It's you've been armed with a set of tools, but how that's actually going to kind of intersect with reality in a meaningful way is still opaque.
Yeah, it's like you can learn the alphabet, but you're not going to be writing sonnets, right? Like there's a set of rules that are sort of applied on top of that sort of change and augment it. And the metaphor I like to use with design patterns especially is because it seems hard to say, but if I just follow it, of course it's going to work, right? Like that's got to make sense. But the metaphor I like to use is simply think of medicine as an entire field, right? You could be told bandages and splints, these things heal you. They make you better somehow. And design patterns to me feels like telling someone that if you apply a bandage, it will make a wound better. But then they don't really know what the connection is. They know there is a connection between bandages and healing. And so someone might have a headache and put a bandage on it. That makes no sense because there's no correlation between those two. And so I don't like teaching it from that perspective, because if you apply it as this is a solution, show me your problem, it'll be sort of me walking around with a square peg looking for a square hole to plug it into, as opposed to the other way around, which is if I explain the concept of an open wound and dirt and infection, it's like, okay, now you can reason about it and go, okay, so the point of a plaster is to stop those things from happening. And so if you approach it from the other way around, that's where you start to gain that sort of the wisdom versus the knowledge, right?
Right. And I think that importantly, right, if you're reasoning from the problem outwards, you could use a bandage. You could also use some glue or some stitches, right? And that fundamentally the goal is to, close the wound and protect it from the outside environment. And there's, you could put somebody in a sterile environment where there is no, dirt or germs, or, I mean, that's very difficult, right? But theoretically, right, you're giving people more of a kind of a position to reason from. And I think that's very interesting. And I wonder a little bit why we're not kind of taking that approach more, right? Or where maybe if there's a way to kind of invert this approach and say, maybe it's because people don't like talking about problems as much as solutions, but it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. I think it's also got a lot to do with there's a certain mindset for some people enjoy the act of problem solving, right? They enjoy that sort of Socratic reasoning through the problems and sort of getting to the solution and sort of like it's one of those things where even myself, when I was younger and I would try to do something, I had a real instinct towards not showing people my work. I really loved working in an isolated bubble and then appearing with the correct answer, like I'm some sort of prophet who just intuits the right answer. And it takes a lot of personal hardship to fight that instinct and to say maybe it's okay if I show people my workings, right? Because then someone's going to correct it, and that correction should feel like a gift, not a curse, right? If someone's correcting your work, it should be, now I know not to do it again. Now my code is better for it. So that sentence they gave me practically improves my work, as opposed to they're telling me I'm wrong. And it's a hard thing to internalize, but once you kind of get that mindset, it starts to become an actual joy to explore the process of what mistakes you might be making so that you don't make them again,
I think that's very interesting, and I think that's we start to kind of see the role of the ego in this whole process, right? Mm. That strong desire to be right the first time, I think, is probably also a big part of the appeal of the idea of these patterns, right? Is that it suggests that there is a right answer, and that I have selected and deployed the correct pattern, or at least a pattern that is defensible in this context, right? And now I can kind of stand up and say, yes, I have, provided the correct solution, which on some level, right, in a professional environment or in a, economically motivated environment, right, there may be moments where you don't want to just look like you're in a totally exploratory mode in front of your boss or client, right? So that's a pretty understandable impulse. But I think what you point to is that desire. I mean, it's interesting. I listened to it as an audiobook, the Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. Which is phenomenal. I really recommend it to anybody who's sort of interested in history. And one of the things that he talks about is science and the advent of science as a kind of a cultural practice, and the fact that the basic position of science being, I'm here to be proven wrong, and I'm going to be happy and excited when proven wrong, right? Whereas that was a kind of a force multiplier, that once we unlocked that orientation, now human technological progress kind of took off like a hockey stick, whereas before we had a situation with the kind of geocentric model of the universe, and where if you were going to go and say that the church or whoever the dominant power structure, I mean, in that case it was the church, right, was wrong, you were going to be murdered,
Yeah. Yeah, Tim mentioned a great quote on that. He said that sometimes people will say to him, your belief in science is no different than someone's religious faith.
Yeah.
And he would say there's a fundamental difference between faith and science, which is science adjusts its views based on what's observed. Faith is a denial of observation to preserve your faith. And so it's keeping faith regardless of what you say. And that's the fundamental difference. The science actively does its best to try to it will pivot and change relative to the situation at hand.
Right, and you have a kind of a culture in science of saying, if this can be disproven, we're going to accept that. First of all, we're going to accept it. I mean, certainly people are human and will fight to prove, no, actually I was right. But as a kind of a community, people are going to say, no, there's new data here. This was incorrect or incomplete assumption. And I think that if we as developers or as people who are trying to get better, especially in because, and I don't know quite why this is, I mean, software developers, and maybe this is true of any group of people creating or building something, but get very opinionated about this stuff and quite forceful. People really.
I've had 3 arguments in the last 2 days purely on arbitrary programming stuff, exactly like that. Yeah.
I mean, what do you think gives rise to that? Because it's. I think it's the nature of programming. We could say it's objectively not good.
Well, I think it's that sort of the creation thing, right? Like it's slightly more than a meme to say that there's a level of sort of divinity to programming, and I don't mean that in a philosophical sense. I purely mean you are literally a creator. You are manifesting things into existence that didn't exist before, and so there's a level of protectivity about what you're doing, about the work you're doing, and to feel confident enough to create means you must to some level feel like you're right, or feel like what you're doing is valuable. Otherwise, you wouldn't create it yourself, right?
Yes.
And so I kind of feel like there's an instinct to defend your work, because it feels like it's not just something you make. It's you. It's your thoughts, your beliefs sort of tied up in something. And even something as simple as writing code, people think it's like, well, the argument is code art. It's a whole different thing. But you can't deny that it's at least representative of the person who wrote it. Because if you've been doing programming for 10 years or so, I can look at a piece of code and I can not only tell who wrote it if I know the various people on the team, I can often tell if someone have not seen their code before. I can guess where they are in their programming education over a span of 8 years or so, purely based on certain design decisions. And it's not down to like whether the code is right or wrong. It's down to the way they're clearly reasoning about problems, right? Like how much they rely on certain things, because there's like a hierarchy everyone goes through about what kind of design architecture they go for. And you can almost tell down to like within a couple of months of their education where they probably are, what books they've probably read recently, which books are currently on their shelf based on the kinds of code they're writing, right?
Isn't that funny? Yeah, I find that very interesting. And I do think, I mean, it's funny. I've never given much thought or engaged with the discussion of whether code is art, but I think that I have definitely had that experience of working with other programmers' code, and first of all, the way that code expresses people's personality, and having very positive and negative experiences of working with other people's code, and thinking there are certain programmers whose code that I've worked with and that I've worked with in the past, and who I just love their code. I just love it. I love being inside it. I feel good when I'm inside. I'm the image I like to use, it's like a clean, well-lighted room. You come in, it's like and there's the workbench, and the workbench is clean, and the tools are laid out, and I come in and I just feel good, and I want to work, and I want to do more. And then there are, some people's code who will remain nameless, so I don't destroy any relationships, but where you come in and you just feel kind of like either you feel sort of oppressed, there's like a kind of a tightness to it, and you feel like
or obfuscation. Sometimes you look at code and it's like this person has actively wrapped this in layers of confusion. And this doesn't feel like an accident, right? Because if you've been in industry programming for long enough, you realize there are certain jobs which are predicated on one person or two people owning a code base. Yeah. And some people have seniority just for the nature of the fact that they're the only person who knows how to navigate this rat's nest of various different things. And so there's, in certain areas, there's a culture around actively engaging and making your code as hard to parse as possible. Yeah. So that you become the de facto person everyone has to go to. And so that's kind of part of it, right? You can sort of tell a person's mindset as a programmer based on whether their objective is to make code that you will enjoy using versus code that they have to go to you for, or you have to go to them for,
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a very interesting one. And I totally get the human and economic dynamics of that, right? Basically what they're doing is building a labyrinth, right? Mm. It's a hostile, maze to keep you out and basically keep you from taking their job. I mean, it's interesting. I think that is also when you think about types of people, that's an interesting one, and not in the programming domain, but I have had conversations with people. I remember a conversation I had a few years ago with a colleague, and I was kind of saying, hey, if we change there's a number of things that we could change here that are quite fundamental and that will make this quite a different operation, but in my opinion, a much more viable and successful operation. And his reply was, we shouldn't do that because we might lose our jobs. You know, that we might, we might jeopardize our kind of fortified position here as the only people who know how to do this. And I am really hostile to that kind of thinking. I really believe that if that is, first of all, it's just an awful way to live your life, right? Like if the only reason that you're able to stay where you are is because you've built this kind of awful rat's nest around yourself. That's a bad situation. Just psychically, you're living in a garbage dump. And also, I really feel like if we are, or at least my experience has been that if you can actually solve the problem in a clean and beautiful and future-oriented way, that nobody's going to fire you. I mean, maybe not nobody, right? Maybe in some kind of toxic environment, maybe, but then you want to be out of that environment anyway, right? It's like
I would say, to be charitable, though, I've noticed it's not always done maliciously. Another example of this, I'd say one of the biggest conflicts that I've seen is if you've got a team full of veterans who've been working on the same code base, and through so the way it tends to work for people who aren't familiar is large companies are deathly afraid of upgrading any software, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Because a lot of systems are built stacked on top of this sort of house of cards of additional systems. And so if a piece works, they will actually often, like most companies, if you get hired by any large company, you are most likely working on minimum 5-year-old tech, minimum, because there's no reason for them to upgrade. And oftentimes companies will even buy outright the source code for legacy code so they can own it in-house rather than upgrade to the new systems, because it's just not worth it. And it's a whole different argument about tiger teams and issues with restarting projects. But I guess my point is, sometimes it's done maliciously. Other times it's purely a basis of somebody has been, through no fault of their own, pigeonholed in a job where they've spent 20 or 30 years working on a particular version of a particular code base. And maybe they are the legacy sort of person on that. And it's simply, that's where their knowledge is. And their work has never given them a reason. So if you work at a startup, you're going to be asked to learn new stuff every week. That's like part of the job. But if you work at a legacy company, you're going to be asked to just be good at the thing you do. And so because there's no need to learn new tech, you will find yourself sort of through almost planned obsolescence, being stuck in a position where there's not much you can do. And I can understand that fear coming from a very earnest place of, I've been told to manage this for 30 years. What am I going to do if they come in and uproot it to new software? And it's going to take me a year to get up to date on all of the new stuff that's happening, you know?
I mean, so I think that is, it's an empathetic perspective and it's a real perspective. And look, not everybody's, some people just want to make a living, right? They want to have a job. They want to be good at their job, help the company or the organization succeed and get paid and go home to their kids, right? That's a valid approach as well. So I think that is important. I think that, the way that different, I mean, that's an important thing, right? Is that you do have, and that's, I've seen that myself, that I think people don't really know this who are not inside some of these places, but most places are just literally kind of like layers of weird stuff kind of glued together on top of each other. And then every, 5-10 years, somebody comes in and says, tear it all, take all this out of here. We're moving to whatever, right? And then there's a big fire that burns down the forest, right? And something new starts. But, you do have that process of, and also, especially if you're dealing with startup-like organizations, I was just talking to a colleague of mine who's working in a kind of a green tech startup, and he was describing exactly this situation that they had a kind of a semi-technical CEO who was just saying, push out, just push out features, and they were just pushing out, and all of it was like, kind of 70% quality, but now you can't say from the business side that wasn't actually the right maybe some of those features, half-baked as they were needed to get certain accounts that were going to get the money that was going to keep the whole thing going, right? So you don't know if it's none of these decisions are being made in a vacuum, right? And there may be
that's what the book Lean Startup says. That's their sort of argument, is they say that there's this weird cyclical. Some people say it used to go from waterfall, large big projects, and you'd stack things. And everyone moved to Agile, but Agile is very enterprise, right? It's kind of implied there's lots of layers and stacking. And the book Lean Startup was implying that what you should do is actually feel free to go fast and break things. Because in this world with so many ideas and so many things going on, maybe you should get your work out there, get people to see it, build that up. And people are more forgiving of that these days, because just look at the sort of the culture around games that are in development, right? Like, people enjoy the journey now. They enjoy the devlogs. They enjoy being part of it. They're more willing to forgive bugs if they're aware that it's part of an ongoing process, right? It's a whole different story if it's a AAA game released with like day one bugs. That's a whole different thing. But if it's something that is being worked on and developed, maybe it is a better idea from a business perspective to get early adopters engaged in your journey, not just in your project, you know?
I mean, I agree. And honestly, I would say even with the AAA game shipping with the day one bugs, I would argue that that's honestly becoming kind of normalized in the culture now, that people are starting to expect that. And I think that's a complex one to kind of make a value judgment about. But what I will say that I think, the lean startup, talking about the lean startup and games is actually a pretty interesting. There are two concepts that I think are difficult to apply to one another a little bit. And for those who aren't familiar, this is the book, The Lean Startup, which is by Eric Ries, which basically is what is responsible for the meme of the MVP, or minimum viable product, right? Which the idea being you need to push out the door something that is as, it's got four wheels and a chassis, and you call it a car, right? And that's the car. And maybe it has no paint, it has no glass in the windows, but you kind of push it out in its most raw state to say, here's a car. Do you like a car? Do you want a car? Right? And actually a car is an interesting example that I just kind of pulled out of nowhere, because it's kind of an aesthetic object, and games are also aesthetic objects. And I feel like this is a, I think the lean startup methodology is very kind of web application startup oriented, where it's really just about it's about functionality and getting adoption and getting that loop of saying we've got users and we're testing and we're validating. But with a game, how do you think those two things come together?
I do see the point, because there's one thing about web which is a lot richer than we have in games, is that if you come from a web sort of mean stack angle, there's a lot of emphasis on build. And so there's a load of architecture around continuous integration and onboarding processes and Git hooks for your various different things, and using, test suites to get ran. And so it's much easier to go fast in a web environment, because you can go fast, push it, run through a series of checks, run your tests, redeploy. Everyone just refreshes the web link, off you go, and you can keep doing this. Games usually require a lot more legwork. And I mean, Unity, for example, if you're building a game and you need to rebake your lighting, you're going to be there for a while. Even with a really good machine, you're still, there's a cost to that. And that's just for lighting, never mind anything else you might want to do, even just nav meshes and whatever else you're going to have to do to build and process that application. And if you're making builds for like mobile, you're going to have to actually build the APK and go through the process and distribute it and, sign it and all sorts of other stuff you may or may not have to do. And so it's not as easy to do that. And that's kind of why I've sort of famous for saying on Charles's channel, it's become a bit of a meme over there, is that I don't actually work in Unity when I make Unity projects. Because for the most part, I feel like most code is code. And if you understand your application boundaries well enough, you can forgo a lot of the build times and cycling and running up a project and trying to get to like that point middle of the game to test that one thing, when fundamentally you can test the interaction in isolation, right? And then once it works as code and providing it's well architected, you can drop it in, hook up a couple things, press play, and it goes. And I find that I try to avoid a lot of that cyclical loop. And so maybe it's harder to be lean when the literal architecture itself is fighting you on that front,
I think that's very interesting. And I do think that that's an interesting, we've seen Unity, actually the it's not the new release yet. It's the beta, the 2020.2 announcement.
The tiny build stuff at the tiny games, because that looks really rapid. Like, I haven't done it myself, but having seen those little games there, that's a really fast deployment.
I mean, what I can't even remember what the official name for it is. For a while, it was UTiny, and then there was like all these code names, and I can't remember what the final. I think it's
Tiny Game was the last thing I saw.
Tiny Games, yeah, it was like the final. It's funny. I remember them saying, like, internally, they were saying, "Never call it UTiny." That is not the name. Everybody was like, "You mean UTiny?" Like, this was kind of a meme, but no, I mean, what I'm talking about is more actually they've been putting in a lot of features to try to do things like improve compile time in the editor.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
the assembly definition stuff is gold. That's one of the things I've been waiting for a very long time. And now especially, apparently, the latest build is going to have even more optimizations to speed up that process. I think that's going to be a very big deal.
I see that, and I think that there is a little bit of a growing acknowledgement on their part that this has been an issue, and the configurable enter play mode now, and there's now a couple things where you can, if you edit prefabs or materials, things that aren't actually touching the C# world, it won't force a recompilation. And
the entire programmable build pipeline, the fact that you can even turn off the automatic compiling, there's a whole load of these features that are designed to customize your build cycle that are really impressive, because that's something that I think has been missing for a long time. If you ever worked in just plain C#, just doing WinForm stuff or class library stuff or whatever, you're probably not familiar with the stuff behind it, but fundamentally it's built using MS Build. And MS Build is the thing that runs the CS proj files or the solution files. And if you open those up, they're just an XML format that basically describes a process which has build targets and outputs and sources. So for anybody who's ever done this stuff, it's kind of fun if you look into how that build is happening. And it's really customizable. Like, you can do a lot of crazy stuff. And the example I did on one of the videos on Charles' stream was that when I build in C#, it's not a tedious project to kind of take the build, drop it into Unity, wait for it to recompile and do all of that work. Instead, I just do a build step where on build of my non-Unity project, export the DLL and dump it to Unity. So there's still seamless integration, right? I can have a window open on one screen, Unity open on the other, and the act of saving and building the project here will refresh Unity and will drop the new code in. So it's not like I'm actually working outside of Unity. I'm just building and sort of programming outside of Unity. But fundamentally, the minute I've made a decision over here, I can just switch screens, drag something on, type a script, and it just appears. There's no step between the two different things. And so build pipeline customization, I think, is one of those things that it's a real time saver once you get into the habit of sort of figuring out where your pain points are and just minimizing the amount of sort of micro wastes of time that you're doing between certain steps.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's super interesting. That's definitely way beyond anything that I've ever tried to do. I mean, my perspective as a programmer is having learned C# in Unity, and it's actually something I'd like to learn, even just for my own edification, is just to try to take some of that C# knowledge that I've acquired in the Unity context and try to apply it outside, just to see what that looks like. I don't even know what I would do, but it's pretty interesting to me. And I think there's an interesting thing there, actually, of I wonder how many people have learned C# only in Unity, and how many of them will, how bidirectional that is how many Unity developers will go out into the C# world. I know there's some people from the C#, .NET world who come into Unity and are like, oh, it's C#, I like that, but
I would say from personal experience, it's purely anecdotal, but I would say somewhere around 70-30 is people who, the 70% are people who got into games either as kids or were interested in learning and kind of did the pipeline through Flash games all the way up and then eventually ended up in Unity stuff. And I would say 30% are people who have a day job they're not entirely happy with, probably on a web platform, possibly on some kind of other C# legacy software, and they like the idea of games. They originally wanted to do games, and they started poking Unity on the side. Because I do a lot of training and tutoring and mentoring and that kind of stuff, and so I get to meet these kinds of people a lot, and I get the questions, again, they kind of divide themselves quite cleanly along the lines of, I know what MVC means, but I don't know how to apply design patterns to Unity because I've I've done this for 5 years. I've never even touched Unity. And the whole component model scares people off. And then there's the inverse. I know what onStart does. I know what onAwake does. I've never seen a static void main function before. And that's scary because there's no concept of cycles and updates and stuff. And it's like the whole event-driven software versus loop-driven is kind of a confusing concept. So I'd say somewhere in the 70-30 range.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one as well. And I think that was something kind of looping back to our first topic of talking about patterns and paradigms. I think that's something that you definitely see. I've definitely seen those people, and I think you mentioned this in your article, who come in saying, I want to create a model view controller or MVC pattern in Unity. And you're like, are you a web developer in your day job?
Yeah. By any chance, have you worked on a web platform before? Yeah.
And I think that's interesting. And I think that I wonder, how much of that is kind of, I don't want to say harmful, but,
I'd say it's 100% harmful. I would have no problem saying that because I was that guy, right? Like I came from the .NET background. I came from the web background. And I probably spent the first year and a half of my Unity career fighting Unity. I did everything in my power to say Unity feels wrong. There's too many entry points. There's too many scripts. I don't like this. I want to have a clean entry point. I want to compose my application. I want my constructors back. Why can't I use constructors? This is very horrible. And I spent the whole time trying to find a way to sort of fix Unity's architectural problem and put real code into Unity. And it took me a very long time to realize that I was fundamentally doing the wrong thing. And not just from a fighting the Unity engine perspective, but in that I didn't really understand why there was a difference. And it's why I harp on a lot about event-driven versus loop-driven, because your objectives are fundamentally different if you're making a game versus enterprise software. And that's something I think you don't appreciate when you first start, because you're told clean code is stuff that's divided along boundary lines. And that's all good and well, but people don't take into account the very simple fact that in an application that's on your desktop, it's event-driven, so it's refreshed by, say, a button press. I type something in, press a button, and so the turnaround time on that is basically, it could be 10 seconds between any interaction on your screen. And because of that, you're free to have an application boundary layer that goes through 5 or 6 steps. It can go to your, go to your persistence layer and then access the database and do all this stuff. And it's all cool and clean and it's modular. And your objectives as a software developer there is to make modular software that lets you swap out the back end without risk if the vendor changes, or swap out the UI if you get a platform change. That's what your objective is. But if you're doing a game, you're not going to swap engine and try to keep 3/4 of your code. You're not really going to be in a situation where you're going to 0 hour change your back-end database structure because you've got a different vendor platform. I mean, it happens sometimes, but the trade-offs for doing that is putting your entire application code base through more architectural boundaries, which are being called 60 times a second or more, right? And so there's a fundamental reason why the architectural structures are different for games than they are for enterprise software. And so there's a big sort of crashing of heads there when you come from a background where everything you've been told is the right way to do it has to be recontextualized for the stuff you're doing in games. And the inverse is true, of course, right? If you come from games and you're told, throw quick scripts on, the point is about interoperability between these things, it's all about this exciting sort of scalability from this angle, and then you're building something that's supposed to load data in, and all of a sudden you're having headaches because you're trying to populate an array of 500 items and dragging stuff in, and it's no, that's where repository goes in. You would never been taught that because it's not part of the world you live in at that stage.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of value in learning both sides so you can find the cross-section between the two. But I don't begrudge anybody for not knowing one or the other, and I don't begrudge anybody for approaching it wrong the first time because you're told to, right? Your every instinct you have is fighting you on what you're trying to do in the engine you're currently working in.
Yeah, I know. I think that's a really, really useful perspective. And I think specifically that kernel of event-based versus loop-based applications. And I think that it's interesting also because you do see games that will drift towards that event-based style, right? If you have turn-based games or
Into the Breach, that kind of thing, where it's literally turn-based, that kind of stuff,
where maybe some of those patterns come back to life a little bit or become more relevant. I mean, this is the other thing that I think is fundamentally very difficult about even I think, zooming out for a second, Unity gets a lot of static for being difficult in various ways. But I think that there's an important detail there, which is that it's, besides maybe Flash or some, I don't know how many other precursor applications we can point to, but the fact that Unity Technologies, the company making Unity, is trying to make this kind of all-purpose, all-platform engine and platform, it becomes really difficult to even, it's kind of a joke, but you're like, the answer to every question is it depends, right? Because you could be making a turn-based 2D pixel art game, or you could be making Fall Guys with 100 characters with physics and networking that need to be synchronized every 30 frames or whatever it is, So I think just there, when you start to say patterns for Unity, it's like, well, what Unity? Where?
Yeah, and I remember this too back in the UDK days. So again, I get a lot of flack for people that because I've championed Unity in the past over Unreal, and we can go over that later. But the thing that was fascinating to me is I remember in the early days, people were like, we need templates for Unreal to see for UDK to kind of, what do you make? And people are like, oh, they've got the out-of-the-box first-person shooter, but you can't use Unreal to make any other kind of game. And it's like, they've got their own templates for making like Flappy Bird and stuff. Like it's a game engine, and it's one of those things where the more you work with different engines and platforms, you realize there's what it looks like it's good at, and then there's what it can actually do. And I think that's a fundamentally different thing, is you kind of realize that just because it's built with this angle in mind doesn't mean it can't do other things. You just have to know what it can do. And I've had this issue before with the Unity Unreal problem, because I've kind of famously said the most amount of disliked comments I ever got was on a video that says Unity versus Unreal, which one do you pick? And I said, personally, I would say Unity is the better engine. And the little asterisk I want to add here is I'm not talking about fidelity and graphics, even though Unity is doing really well in that these days. Yeah. I'm saying that purely from an enterprise perspective, if you're an indie, the most valuable thing you can do is have as many eyes on your project as possible. The best way you can do that is the most amount of platforms as possible. Yeah. And no engine in the world will give you the amount of portability that Unity will. And for that reason, almost alone, to me, it's the better engine from an architectural sort of business standpoint. If you're a AAA, sure, maybe you've got the bandwidth, you've got the teams, you can do other stuff. But if you're sitting there going, should I make my game in Unity or Unreal? I don't think it's very, it's a conflicting statement, or it's very dramatic to say. I think for most people, it's probably Unity, right? Like Unity is better for your startup game to work in.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you 100%. I mean, I'm pretty heavily invested in the Unity ecosystem, and I'm a former employee, so I'm probably not unbiased here, right? Yeah. But what I would say is that, well, maybe to take from the other perspective, I think the people who will benefit from using Unreal are the people with a larger team to put against it, right? I think that Unreal has many things that are great about it, but it's not. It grew to be what it is within the context of Epic Games, which is a traditional AAA studio where you have very clear. You have your artists over here, and your animators, and your riggers, and your, and your technical artists, and you have all these disciplines, and they have these well-crafted tools for that discipline to use, right? And it's quite, if you have a big production and people, you kind of are tiling out the work that way, those two concepts, modes of working, and that software, I think, come together very well, right? Whereas if you are in more of a startup mode and you have a smaller team, or maybe a less kind of battle-hardened team, you're not like a bunch of ex-AAA guys or girls, I think probably Unity puts you in a better position. I think the other thing that Unity has a clear, and again, this is very much me kind of cheerleading for my own work, but where Unity, I think, has a very clear advantage is in their community resources and tutorial stuff.
It just that's one of those things too. I think it's underestimated as a value. A lot of people would say, if your goal is to work in AAA games, if you want to have your name on the next Activision or Ubisoft game, sure, you will probably want to be learning Unreal, because that's what a lot of the big studios will work in. But what you're saying is I'm signing up to be a cog in a 400-person game wheel. And that's fine. That might be what you want to do.
Totally.
But if you learn Unity stuff, you can make your own game, which is something that is much harder to say with Unreal. And I'm not saying it can't be done. Like, I have friends of mine, there's a guy, Olivier, who's got a game called Synthesis Universe. It's a VR game made in Unreal. It's available to purchase. Like, these are one-man teams. It's doable. But I just think you're stacking the deck against yourself when, if you pick Unity, you've got wealth of resources. You've got tons of online stuff. You've got people you're more likely to find fellow indies working in Unity than you are to find fellow indies working on Unreal. And I've seen this. I've been in communities where people are like, hi, I'm in Unreal. Anyone can help me out with this problem. And we're like, no, sorry, we're all Unity people. That's just where it makes more sense for us to be at the moment, you know?
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that's from a business perspective, as a kind of a network effect, that is a really powerful dynamic operating in Unity's favor right now. That they have been pretty thoughtful in terms of positioning themselves that way, of investing heavily in community outreach and in learning materials and so on. And I think that what we've seen is that, and it's interesting because I think Unity has had historically, and now that perception is shifting, but I think it's still there a little bit, is that there's tons of kind of low budget, not super awe-inspiring productions.
The Unity look is what it used to be. Yeah,
student games, exactly. All that kind of stuff that's getting made with Unity, whereas the big next highly visible AAA game may very well be made in Unreal. And I think that continues to be true, but I think what that, as a kind of a long game, that they've kind of created this ocean of creators, and the network effect of that, of everybody, exactly like you describe. Oh, you come into a Discord server and you're like, I'm trying to figure out how to get my AI to work. And people are like, okay, are you using a nav mesh? And you're like, no, I'm in another engine. Or like, are you using Unity's nav mesh solution? You're like, no, I'm in Unreal, and it's a this and it's a that. And they're like, oh, sorry, I don't know.
And for anybody using Visual Studio and Writer, you'll notice it's the same business model. They're very cute in what they do. So if anybody doesn't know this, especially Writer, Writer is right now, I would argue, the best editor when working with Unity. Yeah. But if you are using it, it's free for students. And I don't mean like, you'll get a discount or whatever else. Fundamentally, if you've got an email address that has like any edu-ish thing to it, and you can verify that you're a student, you'll get it for free. Yeah. And people are like, well, why would they give it free for all these people? Well, because if you're learning on their platform, when the time comes that you're an enterprise, you're going to want the tools you're familiar with. And so a lot of these tools, they really want you ingrained at an early stage working with their stuff, because it's a phenomenal business model. It works really well, right? So totally. Yeah, you can get Writer for free. And honestly, I recommend you do, because it is genuinely much easier to work with. It's got a lot of thoughtful things in there that are designed to make... We talked about cutting out those little micro stutters of time wastes for different stuff and whatever.
Yeah, no, and actually Writer's integration with Unity, they've done a really great job and implemented a bunch of features that are really compelling, specifically for Unity.
Like one example, literally something that saves me hours, because I've done this, right? I've done this back in Visual Studio days. There was a problem where I wrote a script and I wrote int health equals 20 or something. And I kept doing my tests and it wasn't working properly because the number 20 wasn't what I expected it to be. And it took me about 40 minutes. Easy to do. You realize it serializes something different in the editor. It's like 100 in the editor, because it's like, oh, so I've just spent the last 30 minutes wasting my time trying to find a bug that turned out to be a different number in the editor than is in the script.
Oh, and I've done this so many times too. You change the variable declaration, you change the initialization value, you forgot that it's already public in the editor and it's not changing.
Yeah, but my point is, in Writer, it puts the serialized value in a little string label right beside the value of the number you've written down. And that one change has fundamentally saved me hours. Like, it's one of those things that, like, these things add up where you go on a big bug hunting spree, and these like micro savings are really you're going to be very grateful to have them.
No, I mean, and especially when it comes to debugging, right? I think, my favorite expression about debugging in software is, it's like, welcome to debugging where you're always the idiot, right? It's like, it's very rare that it's a compiler error, or that it's it's always that, like, oh yeah, I forgot to change the value of the variable or whatever it is, or forgot to drag something in the inspector if you're working in Unity. And
I always laugh when you see that in a forum. Someone's written a comment going, is there a bug with this particular method in Unity? It's like, What's more likely, that there's this bug in a very commonly used method in Unity that you've just happened to hit, or that nobody else in the world has hit, or that you've probably, oh yeah, I didn't initialize a variable up top. There you go. That's probably what it was. You know?
Totally. No, I think it's it's funny. No, I think they're doing a great job over at Rider, and I actually observed that Microsoft has been. It looks like to me paying attention, and there's been a number of features popping up in Visual Studio for Unity that are kind of, seem to be watching what's going on.
Time one is the big one, right? Because Visual Studio has always been my favorite editor. Even now, even as I'm shilling for Rider, which I'm not actually sponsored by the way, even as I say how much I enjoy using it, I still prefer Visual Studio when working with XML, when working with XAML, with working with WinForms. Like, it's not gone from my roster of stuff. It's just specifically for Unity, Rider works really well. But I've noticed that the major complaint used to be Visual Studio is beefy. It's a really big engine because it's not built for games or whatever, right? Like, it's built to work on everything from web to enterprise to Azure integration to database stuff to ADO.NET to there's a million features in that engine that's really, really slow. So for an IDE, you're paying a lot of that cost. So if you try to edit a script, everything's recompiling. It's a whole. So also, it didn't have native integration, which caused extra issues. So I think their pivot to VS Code as the alternative solution. So it's either Rider or VS Code these days. They're kind of where you want to be. I think that's a really smart move because you're getting that much faster turnaround time for your code. And again, it's something that's really important to me is you want to cut out all of these little time wastes because they really, really add up. You cannot underestimate how much waiting for a compile that lasts 1 minute will eat into your time. Because there's a famous study that showed if someone has a minute and a half or 2 minutes of a delay while they're working, what are you going to do in those minute and a half? You're going to be waiting for a minute and a half. You're going to open up Twitter or Reddit or Facebook or something.
Or get a cup of coffee it's true.
One minute becomes 5 becomes 10. All of a sudden, that 1 minute will turn into 10 minutes, and you'll realize how much of your day you're wasting doing this stuff.
Yeah, no, I definitely experience that. And I think especially in a creative process or, having worked on music and done other stuff and then also done programming, I've got to say that programming is probably the most sensitive, maybe I just have a kind of a fragile brain, but it's the most sensitive to interruption. I feel like it really takes me time to kind of load this whole structure and it's kind of orbiting around my head. And then, the phone rings and it just goes,
Yeah. There's another one too. It's the classic flow state meme, right? Where you're programming and it's almost like you see all the numbers floating in front of you. It's I have it. Okay, I'm working on this thing. And someone says, oh, can I get your attention for a sec? What? Oh, actually, never mind. Okay. And then you're what was I doing? Oh, and then you're back to square one and you're trying to rebuild all of that again. Yeah.
I really experienced that. I experienced that I'm not going to say uniquely, but to a extreme degree in programming. I feel like it's one of those things where maybe because I've just been reading this book right now, which is called Advanced Game Design by Michael Sellers, which I highly recommend to anybody who's interested.
Or write that down myself. I'm looking for more books at the moment. So.
It's great. It's real. I've only read the first 3 chapters or something, which is purely which also actually loops back to our discussion around design patterns, but it's purely a kind of primer on systems thinking. And what's very interesting is he brings in a bunch of examples of some of the seminal books about pattern thinking, including, I think it's called A System of Patterns or A Language of Patterns, and which was actually an architecture book.
Yeah, that's famously quoted as the inspiration for the Gang of Four book and for some of Bob Martin's stuff. He says that that is an inspirational theory behind design patterns, even as a principle.
And what's very interesting is he pulls all these references from, and they're really from its architecture and all these different disciplines, which for me, that really, carbonates my brain. I love that stuff of thinking about how is an architect thinking about this and this person and that person and how that all kind of abstractly synthesizes. But one of the things that, he is just thinking about complexity and thinking about systems that create loops and feedback and changes. And software is very much, I mean, depending on the nature of the software, right? Some software is very linear, but especially games, actually, you have these systems that have the capacity to modify each other and change state. And for me, it's really hard to think about on paper. I'm actually in that process now of trying to do some game design for my cute space game and trying to do it on paper. I actually started, at your recommendation, I started to use Nuclino, which I really like so nice, far.
Yeah, it's good UI.
It's cool. I think I'm actually going to do a little short video about it on the channel just to make people aware, because it's a cool tool. It's for those who don't know, it's like a little bit like somewhere between Google Docs and Evernote and one of these note-taking programs, but it's got a list view, a kind of Trello card view, and then a graph view, which is my favorite. Which is
really fun, of course. Yeah, the graph view is the best one.
It's totally the best. And what's fun about it, this is a total tangent, but it's fun, is when you open the graph view in Nuclino, you get this little animation. It does this little like boop, 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 all the little nodes kind of wiggle around. And there's something about that I find so juicy and satisfying that in a note-taking, writing, graphing application, I think that there's an intuition and a recognition in the design of the tool that this is a creative tool. It feels like a creative tool to me. It feels a little bit fun to work with, and it makes me want to use it more, which I think is an interesting thing.
My one complaint with them is that it's very much marketed as a project development tool.
Yeah.
And so they're super keen on getting people, like you pay for seats, you get people to use it, that kind of thing. And it's one missing feature that's a real killer for me. And the reason I don't use it for anything other than personal note stuff is you can't do the Trello thing and have a public board.
And
you
publish it.
Yeah.
I guess because it works against their revenue model.
Yeah, which is a pity. Like, I would even pay for an offshoot of it that would allow me to do those kinds of things. Right. But I 100% from a business perspective see what they're doing. But it's a real pity because it's such a nice tool. I would love for it to be something I could sort of use as a teaching tool and put notes up there and share with people and that kind of stuff. But it unfortunately doesn't seem to be their angle.
I mean, who knows? Who knows where they'll get to with it, right? I mean, I think they're a startup, so they may be still in an iteration mode. I don't think they're that well known yet. So maybe that's the secret sauce that they're missing, right? Is to pivot in that direction. We'll see, I guess. But yeah, I've been enjoying working with that a lot. But I think that, this systems point, like I'm trying to draw pictures of these things. I'm trying to visualize them. I'm trying to think about them. And for me, the only thing that really works and that, that is in that kind of flow state of programming is like when I'm like hours into it, or at least, or an hour or so into it, and it's all kind of floating in RAM in my brain. And then I can start to kind of transform it and think about it and reason about it. But otherwise, I find it incredibly difficult.
I actually, this is one of those things, it's sort of a fun experiment I recommend every programmer try at least once, which is put on your webcam and just leave it on during the course of a day or two of work. And it's really interesting that you'll find that you spend maybe 30%, 20% or 30% of your time touching your keyboard. The majority of the time will be spent staring at the screen, scratching your head, reading notes, planning stuff, maybe humming and hawing, deleting a few lines, putting a few things. The amount of time you type, that's what people think, right? Programmer is a guy who types things, person who does typey stuff. But it's not. Like the amount of your time that is spent just reasoning around problems, it's a lot more cerebral than people think it is, because it's really coming down to decisions that stack on top of each other. And that's kind of where the architecture stuff comes in, right? Because you're trying to make good decisions, and you're panicking yourself over stacking the right ones on top, and like, how does this play into this? And that tends to be where a lot of the time actually goes.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely have that experience, and it's funny too. I mean, it's funny and also like really painful, but like being in the house with, I work at home, so I've got my kids in the house and my girlfriend is in the house, and they'll come in the room and see me just kind of like sitting there like this. And they're like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, I'm like deep in thought. I'm about to solve it, and they're like, "Oh, Dad, I'm hungry. Make me a sandwich," and it's like, but it's true. It's a lot of it is thinking, right? It's a kind of intensive form of thinking. And
like another one I bet most people will experience at least once in their life, which is you'll be working on some project, you'll leave, go get coffee, you'll feel despondent and just sort of, I just can't figure it out. And someone is going to ask you, are you okay? Is there something wrong? Because they're going to think there's something seriously wrong, that like, you've heard some bad news, because there's just that look of just dejected, I can't figure this out. And then you'll go to bed and you'll wake up and go, in the middle of the night, I have it, but I can't not do this now, because if I forget about it, I won't know it tomorrow. So you'll get out of bed, you'll go downstairs and you'll type the solution just so it's out of your brain. That's one of those things that I think happens to every single programmer at least once.
That's amazing. And also, I do feel like that is one of the things that is, interesting about programming as a discipline in terms of kind of like personal development, for lack of a better term, is that there are these, a big chunk of the time we spend stuck and blocked. And, it's really like, and even if you're not blocked, you're kind of like, do I want to do this? Like, I'm gonna punch a hole in the wall and run the cables through, and I know it'll work, but like, am I gonna really do this to myself? And that kind of wrestling with either feeling like an idiot, right? Or kind of like wrestling with these compromises where you're like, this is so ugly, but I know it's gonna work and it's gonna get done.
Well, to circle that back around, right? So here's two personal bits of advice I think really help with that. One of them is that a lot of people I find will code themselves into a corner, because in an attempt to preempt some large architectural complex problem, you'll start making assumptions. And the common one for me is whenever someone writes an interface or some sort of abstracted concept, and then they come onto the Discord or whatever, and they go, I've just limited the scope of my thing. I've turned it from a player into like a interactable or a healable. How do I get back all the other stuff? How do I expand it back out so I can get other values out of player? And it's like, well, you've basically put invisible walls in your house under the assumption you might want more rooms later. You're putting blocks in your way because it feels architectural. And I find that the problem is to step back. And the trick I use is every line of code should add value. So if you're sitting there going, I sat down, my goal is to add health. My goal is to make this explode. And you should be doing things that actively do that goal. If you realize you've just spent 30 minutes writing the explodable manager, pooling, whatever, you're like, have you actually done the thing you came to do? Or did you just go on a tangent building architecture that doesn't actually solve your problem? So if you instead start with the problem, solve it, and then step back. And the trick is architecture comes from software. It's not something you put into software. So once you pause and go, it now does what I want it to, I can now refactor out good bits, tidy bad bits, and then you scale it that way. So you'll find yourself getting in a lot less of those mind-bending, confusing issues if you work as a solve the problem, fix the mess I just made, solve the next problem, tidy it a bit, and it grows into something based on requirements, not the other way around. You're not assuming requirements and then trying to fit your code into it, which I think is the real cause for a lot of headaches.
No, I think that's actually pretty profound, and I think that that imagining potential future requirements, right? That so many of us try to do when we try to program. We're trying to come up with a class, an inheritance hierarchy, interfaces, some kind of modular system. And you're like, wait, what do you want to do? You want to make the box explode? Okay, first make the box explode, and then decide if that's even a problem. How many boxes are in the game, right? Mm-hmm. There's one. Just make it explode. Move on. If it's a game where there's going to be 7,000 different types of exploding box, maybe then now we need to have a system or something more complex, right? Or more generic or kind of extensible. But a lot of the time, it's like actually that box. And then half the time, right, you're like, the exploding box was not good. We cut it out.
Yeah, it's not even a feature we did. And a way to, kind of another part of this is the word interface itself specifically refers to taking two disparate systems and making a way for them to communicate. Like you're literally interfacing between two systems. And something I always find very interesting is when someone says, how do I make an interface or an abstract thing between these two? And it's like, well, you're building the thing where a health system causes something to die. Where's the interface needed? Are you going to be hooking this health system to the stock exchange? Is there some interface that needs to be connected? No, like this is a set system. Why are you like slicing it in half and then trying to reconnect between the bars of the barrier you made? And if you realize that you're building one thing, you can start there quite comfortably. And then to get around this fear of I've now built this system. So I've built this health system and it's got nice boundaries and it's clean and it's modular. You're going to eventually hit that edge case where you're going to feel like, oh, I have to cross a line or a boundary in my own system that breaks it. And now I feel icky again because I'm like hacking into my own code. Well, there was a great comment from Jonathan Blow working on his current puzzle game that really clicked with me. And he said he had this code where there's lily pads that you can step on. And there was a weird edge case where based on the structure of the code, if you stepped on it in a certain way, it did, which is the right way, and it had different kind of scenarios. And so he effectively hard-coded the answer. And there's that like recoiling moment as a programmer. You're like, hard-coded the answer, like wrote a very specific one-time solution, but it's supposed to be modular. It's supposed to handle every case. And he said something along the lines of, your goal in, especially game development, more so than normal software, is you're trying to give the user a good experience. And if you're actively choosing to make decisions that make for a worse experience to maintain the cleanliness of your code, something's gone wrong, right? You're trying to keep the system sane, but you're willing to like remove your own creativity in the process. It's such a weird angle. And so once I internalized that idea, it's like, hang on a second, I should be allowed to write code that makes my game better. And then I'll find a way to fit it into the system I've written, not the other way around. I'm not going to remove features that will make the game feel better just because it doesn't feel like it fits the structure I'm in. And I think that was to me, that was a very sort of profound thought to have, you know?
I mean, I think that is super, super important. And honestly, I think that a big part of it, right, is that it hinges on is that these are games, right? It's unless it's a kind of some kind of abstract game making platform foundation like Roblox or something where there might be 100,000 games built on top of it, then maybe we need these very pure and abstract rules and structures. But if it's lily pads and there's one level in the game with the lily pads and we just need the player to not clip through the edge of the lily pad when they step on it the wrong way, then hard coding it, first of all, is a practical solution. And I mean, I think it comes back to kind of, it's pragmatism, right? It's like saying, what am I trying to do here? I'm trying to give the player a good experience. I mean, I think an interesting example of this was all the discussion around the code for the platformer game Celeste. They published the character controller that they shipped with, right? And it was like the huge
2000 line monster of
and a lot of people were like, scandal, unclean, but it's like, but you know what? Like, first of all, it was a two core person team, right? They were intimately in this code and knew it. There wasn't 40 anonymous people who were going to have to come in and maintain it, right? And they achieved what I think many people agreed was a great feeling, and it was exactly about handling all of those little, like a good platformer controller, I think we've learned through the years, is about handling a million corner cases and literal edge cases, right? It's like the amount of time that you can go off the edge of a platform collider and still be able to jump.
Coyote time, yeah.
Coyote time. I love that term, right? It's amazing. But like that is in the platonic world of game simulation, right, is totally wrong. You're actually breaking the rules. You're breaking the rules in the player's favor. But it feels good and it feels right, and the player is going to enjoy it more, right? So
my favorite one is BioShock. The enemies will always miss you first.
The first shot will always miss.
First shot will always miss you, so you always have that chance. And same with the health bar. The health bar, like, it'll never go straight to zero. You'll actually, and there's other games too which do it where if you're shot from behind, like, and you don't notice it, the shots do less damage, specifically until you see them, just because it feels bad to be killed by someone off screen, right? Like there's all of these little tricks that make it feel better, because that's the point, right?
And that's amazing, right? And what we're trying to do is we're trying to create an experience, right? We're trying to create an experience for the player where if it's a shooter game, the player feels powerful and capable, right? Getting shot from behind and insta-killed is the opposite of that, right? It feels terrible, it feels terrible and impotent,
Yep.
And so I think that and just saying, hey, yeah, we're going to do that. I mean, I remember dealing with that. This was my first game that I still haven't finished, and it's kind of lying dormant that I kind of lie to myself and say I'm going to finish it someday, which is this. It's called Monarch Black. And
the Project Graveyard, I've got a few of those myself.
Oh, I still haven't kind of like publicly admitted that it's dead. But you had 6 degrees of freedom and you're flying around, and the enemies all the time would shoot the player from above and behind and all of these off-camera positions. And I was trying to get this tightly balanced thing where if you got hit, it was pretty consequential. It was really bad to get hit. And that felt good when you were kind of making risks and doing, taking decisions and making a big risk, but not getting shot or getting shot. But then when you just would get zapped from behind and above, it was like roguelike. So it was one life, and you could really just get nuked and lose all your progress. And it felt so bad. And I had not learned those lessons of BioShock, and that's what I should have done. I should have just hard-coded in there.
Because it's one of those things that people don't realize is that people think, oh, you want AI that's really smart. It's like, it's really, really easy to make really smart AI because AI have perfect knowledge.
Yeah.
They know where everything is at all times. It's very easy to make a smart AI. It's actually really hard to make a good, dumb AI because you want them to be dumb enough that it feels like you're getting one over on them, but not that they're just walking the walls, right? There's that fun line of trying to make them look smart, but humanly smart, where they're not going to do weird stuff. It's actually a really hard challenge to do.
Yeah, and you don't want the AI to like really cleverly, block you into a corner and then flank you and throw a grenade into the room and you're trapped and you die, right? Like for a player, that would be a great strategy, and the player would feel great if they did that to the AI. But if the AI does that to you, it's like feels awful, I think it's a little bit, I think that there's an interesting, it's a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's interesting that really games it's like a theater, right? We're putting all these AI and all these characters are putting on a performance for the player. It's not there's an element of simulation, but fundamentally it's not a simulation, right? Unless it's like, I don't know, The Sims, or there's probably a much smaller subset of games that really are, or Dwarf Fortress, or some of these kind of pretty edge case type heavily simulationist games. Most games really are not a simulation. It's a kind of a play on a stage for the player to experience, and I feel like maybe that's an under-recognized fact, or maybe just by me.
It comes back to what you're saying before about there being a very interesting cross-disciplinary thing about games, and I forgot who said it. It was very famous. The quote somebody said that was, games are the ultimate art form. Now, whether you call it games or not art, it's fine, but the quote was that it's the ultimate art form because it encompasses all other art forms. Like a game is music, and it's movies to some degree, and it's cinematography, and it's writing, and it's all of these things, but it's also interactive. It's all of these things plus something that none of the others are. And I don't know how much I agree with the quote, but I do think that one interesting element of games is that there is knowledge you can learn in completely disparate fields, or at least seemingly disparate fields, that come into play a lot. And something that's really clicked for me recently, funnily enough, talking about architecture, is I've always been really, really bad at level design. It's just been fundamentally a skill. I couldn't hack it. I just couldn't figure it out because there was sort of an analysis paralysis. I kind of feel like the kind of mindset that likes building complex systems freezes when you're trying to build something that is more thematic. And the example for me was I'd open up a blank terrain in Unity and I'd be holding a tree in my prefab and I'd be going, where do I put the tree? And you'd say, it doesn't matter. So I put a tree down and then I'd look at it and go, that tree's really conspicuous. There's just a tree there. They're going to look at it and go, why is there a tree? And it's so stupid. Like I'm in my own head, like really overanalyzing this. And it's because I came at it from the angle of trying to compose a scene. I was like trying to envision the perfect environment and then build a perfect environment. And it wasn't until I really went down a journey learning level design and color theory and architecture that I was like, okay, what if I don't try to build a level, but I try to build an experience? And then I look at what tools are available to do that. And the thing that really clicked for me was like, if I'm building a room, do I want the room to feel oppressive? Do I want the room to feel interesting? Or do I want the room to feel cozy? And if I want it to feel oppressive, I want slim, high windows. That is like the universal architectural thing for prisons and for kind of small environments. You put these strip windows at the top and it makes a room feel claustrophobic and dark and oppressive. If you want people to be sort of voyeuristic and look around and try to find things, you want rounded corners. You want edges where it's low windows, because low windows make people think there must be something in there, so they're going to look into it. And so you can direct a player's experience through tools that aren't really programming or game development. It's more a case of learning, what do certain colors do? How does leading lines work? How do you use light to draw lines to get people's attention? And this may specifically be about level design, but the point is there are certain things you can learn that have kind of conceptually nothing to do with game development. Web design, for example. A lot of my UI experience and UX experience comes from years of working on client web applications where I have people clicking on buttons, and I now know what people click on and what certain buttons do and various different things. And it's like, I now have a better understanding of a user's experience of a user interface because I've seen them do it in boring banking apps, but the same rules apply, right? So there's certainly a lot of value in cross-disciplinary stuff. And I find that games kind of let you play with that in a way most other sort of fields don't, you know?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's an interesting one. I have always personally wrestled a little bit with the fact that I am a very omnivorous person in the sense of learning, that I really want to learn all these different things. And that necessarily means that I never learn any of them to what some would call
Jack
a level
of all trades, master of none, as they say. Yeah.
That's the kind of the meme, right? And I wrestle with that, and I feel not good about it in some ways. But what I've started to experience as I've gotten older is having those moments that you're describing of saying, oh yeah, when I was working on the banking app and I made the button white instead of black, people would see it and they would click on it or whatever it was, and having those kind of moments of synthesis where things come across from different disciplines and start to cross-pollinate and start to come to life. And that's definitely an experience I've had that's made me feel more comfortable allowing, so obviously there's practicalities, right? And I need to make a living and I need to, get certain things done. I can't just endlessly drift around learning new things, but I have started to give myself a little bit more personal permission to say, you know what, if you're getting, for whatever reason right now, I've gotten obsessively interested in men's fashion. And there's some very interesting designers doing things that are very much almost like conceptual art in the world of men's fashion. I've been learning about this guy, Craig Green, who builds he makes regular jackets, and he's a British designer who's based in Paris now, but he makes these very, normal parkas and jackets and so on that he sells in the stores. But then in his runway shows, he builds these things that literally looks like a tent. It's like a whole structure around the body, literally with tent poles, and it's crazy. I mean, it's literally like a sculpture that this person is walking down the runway, wearing inside. And one of his first shows, he did this thing where people were all the models had these wooden boards on their face. It was really like something out of Bloodborne, it was really wild stuff. And for whatever reason, I've just kind of gotten obsessed with that. And I'm watching all these YouTube videos about it and going down that rabbit hole. And now, having been through this cycle a few times of kind of getting obsessed with music or getting obsessed with this or that, or, I'm kind of seeing these loops kind of close back and come back and how these things interact. And I'm getting more comfortable with that. And the experience I've had in my professional life is actually that in surprising moments, those weird mixes of experiences become super valuable.
I've gotten jobs that were about, I almost exclusively got them because an element of it came up that required creating a web API. And it's most game devs don't have experience building web APIs. And I'm like, I can help you with that. And even on simpler levels, there's been stuff where I've been in a conversation working on a project where I've been contracted to work on some Unity thing, but they're doing some web design stuff to promote it.
Yeah.
And I would sort of say, hey, do you mind if I just have a conversation about this? And I would say, well, do you know there's actually web safe colors? And if you're trying to do contrast for your foreground and background, there's the WCAA web compatibility contrast ratio. You probably want roughly a 4:1 for here and a 7:1 for here. And so I've like got this interdisciplinary stuff that I find, from my perspective at least, feels like where I bring the most value to a team. Because I've made the joke before that like I can be a code monkey just like anybody else, but realistically you can find other people in often cases to do the kind of work you're hiring me for. But there's sometimes there'll be an area where I will kind of actually pause midway through what I'm doing and I'll say, look, I can continue doing that if you like, but I see you're also doing this and I actually have a bit of experience there, and either I can help you with it or I can help you find somebody, and I've actually been brought on to help vet new employees. I've worked as a contractor and they've brought me into the meetings for hiring other people,
right,
just to see if they know what they're talking about, because I've done a bit of this, that, or the other. And I find that it is, as you said, it's kind of amazing how much these random things that will sort of help out in various different jobs and various different kind of scenarios that you just don't plan for. And I think that's from the well-rounded perspective. The original quote wasn't actually Jack of all trades, master of none. It was Jack of all trades, master of one, with the implication being that you learn and master your trade, but respect all the others because they'll inform the one that you're actually the master of, or at least that's how you become a master.
Oh, that's interesting. I never heard that about that quote.
Yeah, it's often misquoted, but what I find what's really interesting about that is that's where I think the most value is, right? It's where whatever you choose to do, whatever you find is your valuable passion or whatever, learning from another field and then having a eureka moment, that's such a satisfying feeling where you're like, I'm learning lessons from something that's completely unrelated, but like I can see where it connects because I'm in this place, but I'm getting valuable tidbits from elsewhere,
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's super, super, super interesting. And I hope that is something that I know, I don't know, especially as a younger person, I'm 41 now, and I remember being 21 and being filled with ambition and desire to go out and be great. And I remember worrying about these kind of things, and worrying about learning the right things, investing my time in the right things, and so on. And I think that I hope that that hearing this for any 21-year-olds listening, that this can help you to understand that, hey, if you're passionate about something, I mean, I think the whole follow your passion thing is actually overrated, and that's a whole, maybe another conversation. But I think that if you're passionate enough about something to learn it and be good at it, right, to some degree, right, that you can actually contribute and say, yeah, actually, you know what, I know about web interface. I can tell you something about that, right? I spent time trying to be good at that. That in and of itself is worth doing. And, even if that literal thing doesn't come back up, it may be that you're called upon, you end up doing cinematography, and we need to talk about colors and composition, and actually some of the things you learned about color when you were doing web now come to the fore,
It's not always a direct thing too. So it may seem like you're saying, oh yeah, but you learned web and that was applied to games. I mean, there's some kind of corollary. Here's one. I think one of the most valuable things I have as a person for a lot of the stuff I'm doing is I'm moderately comfortable on camera. I can talk to people, I can present, and where I got that from is I was a shy kid. And one thing that I used to do as a hobby was magic. And I used to do stage show magic stuff. And I used to actually go and do they'd pay me to do a conference thing, where there'd be a conference table and I'd go around and I'd do tricks and that kind of stuff. And that teaches you a lot about direction and about storytelling and about how your hand movement works and how to gauge attention. And one of my favorites being attention, because the whole point of magic is to subvert attention and get people looking one way while you do something else. And that doesn't just teach you how to get attention, it tells you when people are attentive. And that's really valuable, because you'll find in meetings, you can talk to people and you can gauge how much on board they are with certain ideas based on their attention. And oftentimes you can pivot your presentation. So, for example, job interviews. If I'm in an interview and I'm talking to people and I'm doing stuff, if I say something and I notice a perk of excitement or interest in someone's eyes, it's like now I will start pivoting in that direction because I've got a hook. I know this is something they care about. And oftentimes you don't know, right? They're hiring you for this, that, or the other, the A and B, and you're like, oh, I've done this. And they're like, oh, okay, you've done it. It's like, there we go. That's it. That's the thing I'm now going to talk about for the next 5 minutes, because so there we go. Magic. That's something that fundamentally helps me on a daily basis with presentations and job interview stuff. So there you go. That's
I love that. I think that's a kind of a perfect illustration of what we're talking about here. And I think that the being able to interact directly with people and understand that kind of verbal, nonverbal, physical, all those cues, all that communication that's going on, being able to do that well, especially as you get into the kind of work that we do, so much of what we do is about communication, right? And is about communicating effectively, clearly, being empathetic, understanding what is this landing with this other person, and honestly, in the work that I'm doing now with Thousand Ant and running our agency, I mean, my girlfriend jokes to me, she's like, literally all you do is talk on the phone, and partly it's true. And so much of what I'm doing is just talking to people and being like, well, what do you think? Are you interested in this? Does this sound good? Do you want to give me some money? We could do this. Let's go, and that conversation could be a conversation that provides a whole bunch of people's livelihood for a couple of months, and it's so important, and not being good at that is one of those things where it's like that it could really limit your life. So
and I would say that a lot of people misattribute this the kind of specific we're talking about now as being, oh, that's all good and well if you're doing presentations, if you're on stage, if you're doing this kind of stuff. And it's like, it really isn't that. Even if it's not even Zoom or Skype calls, even if we're talking presenting in that respect, one of the most valuable things for me as my entire career was learning requirements gathering. Because I think that's one of the biggest failings in a lot of software houses. It's where there's sort of this understanding. If you work in a big shop, if you work in sort of a larger company, they're going to have someone dedicated to being the devs, the project manager, and then the person who talks to the marketing / the product owner, as they call it. And effectively, you get to avoid having that conversation. So you get the freedom of going, someone will write on a piece of paper what they want, they'll hand it to me, I will verbatim do the thing on the paper, hand it back, and I've done my job. And I think that leads to a very dangerous mindset of work to rule, where you're developing your stuff to match what was written, not trying to understand what the client wants. And the more you start working for yourself, the more you're going to have these conversations. And somebody may fundamentally say something to you, I want X. But if you've done this long enough and you know how it works, you might be like, I don't think they want that. I actually think they want something else. Yeah. And if I can have a conversation and tease out what they really want, we can save all of ourselves 3 weeks of wrong ideas and wasted time and misalignment in various things. And so it's not even about presenting. It's about being able to empathize with what the problem someone has is, so you can help deliver the best project that you can,
Absolutely. No, and I think this actually goes back to a very interesting conversation you had with Charles a while ago about freelancing, which was I think it was a 2-part series that you guys did. There was tons of valuable information there for anybody who's interested in working in this business. But I think that I think that this is it's a difficult piece of advice to give to, especially to younger people, right? Because it's hard to action, but trying to really understand the business goals and why are we doing this? What are we solving here? What is you want to make the button red. Why is the button red? Is it because we're going to drive more sales because the button is red? Well, actually, we have some other data that shows that, a green button is going to drive more sales or whatever it is. But if you just say, he said, make the button red, so I made the button red, and then there were 0 sales and the company went out of business and I did my job, and it's like, well, the company went out of business, and the reason actually they hired you was because they were trying to keep their business going.
And a good example of this is VR in general, right? I've done 5 years of various different VR development, and a common thing that I don't want to repeat a lot of what I said in that Charles talk, but the general idea was a lot of clients come to you and they don't know VR. They're coming to you because this isn't a field they know, and so they will say things that are coming from a place of literally no information. So I have had clients say, and I want to be able to fly around like a bird. And I have to say, Let me stop you right there. You don't want to fly around like a bird. That sounds cool, but trust me, it's going to make people sick. And so this is one of those things where they're not paying you for just code monkey skills, right? They're paying you for the understanding of what the problem is and to try to solve it. And I find that in answer to what you were saying about how hard it is to internalize that, I think the problem is when you first start your career, it feels combative. It feels like you're either the little fish trying to show off what you're doing, like I know better, or I'm smarter, or I can do all of this stuff, or I've just come out of all this training, all of these people aren't listening to me, they aren't listening to my advice. And I'd say you can easily kind of back yourself into a corner where people don't want to work with you, or where you come across as a difficult person. And in general, you will kind of cut off your nose to spite your face, as they say. And I think the perspective that will help you personally is to see each challenge as, can I do the thing that's even better than they realize they want? So if you don't make it as they gave me stupid requirements, or the requirements aren't well written, or it's hard to understand, or they haven't made themselves clear, or as something I've said before, I've literally done, they asked for a login thing, never asked for logout, and they're like being really time boxing with me, and they're saying, well, I want this done at exactly this time. And I'm like, fine, logout will take me more time. So if I just don't tell them that they forgot to write logout, I can be smug and say it's not in the requirements. I did it exactly as you delivered it. Yeah. And then I feel smart. But it's like, yeah, and now they're angry at you. It doesn't do what they want. And you look like someone they want to work with. If I just flagged that up, they would have allowed more time for it because it's a new feature. And me trying to be smug didn't help me there at all. And I think if the goal is instead, can I intuit their requirements better than they know themselves and produce something that's better than they even realize they want, I can take pride in my work and I can be good at it too. So I think it's that subtle perspective shift of, it's hard to find joy in being challenged, but it's if you can find joy in making a better product, then you know.
No, I think that's a great perspective, and I think that also connects back to this idea of being well-rounded, right? Is if you're kind of myopically focused on your single discipline, which is writing code, and then, you know, you're like, well, I wrote the code. I executed the requirements. I made a red box, and they didn't ask for a logout, so there isn't one. And, you know, well, first of all, there's a very good chance that you're going to get replaced by a bunch of machine learning algorithms very soon, right? But, you know, you have not, what they came to do was to solve problems in their business and to make them more successful, and you're an expert. And if you had said, hey, listen, I'm an expert in this, and I think what you want is this, and you're saying you want this, but, you know, there might be actually an even better solution, then, you know, let's consider this. And then if they say, no, actually, we just want it read and no logout, you're like, okay, well, then I tried to help you, you know. Well, I think that's a really a great place to kind of bring this in for a landing. I just want to say thanks so much for taking the time to come on. It's super fun to chat. I've really enjoyed the conversations that you and Charles have been publishing, and I encourage everybody to go and check those out if you haven't already. And if you're enjoying the content on the channel, don't forget to like and subscribe, as we say here on YouTube. You can also listen to this on audio on iTunes or it's not even iTunes anymore. It's Apple Podcasts and many of the other podcast platforms. You can find it there. But I just wanted to say thanks so much. And Jason, is there anywhere that you want to, you know, for people who want to learn more about you and your work or to connect with you, that you want to direct them to?
Well, I guess if you want to talk to me, I predominantly hang out on the Infallible Code Discord. I'm actually also in the 1000 Ant Discord too. You can find me there if you want to say hello. Other than that, thanks for having me too. It was fun. I always enjoy the conversations we have. It always meanders in a way that feels satisfying, right? We cover a lot of random but interesting topics.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, and hopefully we'll do it again soon.
Cool.
All right. Bye.